Day 63 of quarantine. The world has fallen. New Zealand is the last bastion of civilization remaining. On their solitary island, how do these survivalists stop their country from falling into chaos? We did it! We cured the virus! Not coronavirus, but one of Pandemic's 4 viruses that you and your friends have to stop together. But, of course, you'll need to maintain that 2-meter social distancing between you and your friends in order to play. In fact, New Zealand, we're so good at social distancing that Pandemic doesn't even think that we exist. We don't even appear on the map, r/maps without New Zealand. The viruses actually have no chance of ever reaching us at all, because, if you didn't know, New Zealand is in fact a myth. Pandemic is a cooperative game where you take on the role of scientists, virologists, dispatchers, and quarantine specialists and more in order to stop the spread of 4 deadly viruses across the world before time runs out. Now, last time we discussed Spirit Island, and I called that perhaps the best cooperative game for board gamers out there. And if that's true, then, well, Pandemic is perhaps the best cooperative game for casual or non-board gamers out there. Now, a lot of really good board games just are simply not that accessible to the average or casual player. You don't want it to take an entire game for them to learn how it works, and then another 1 or 2 games for them to even start to really enjoy it. The beauty of Pandemic is that your friends will pick it up in 2 to 3 turns flat. It's that simple, while also being masterfully strategic. Each character you can play has one simple special ability. That's it. For example, the scientist can cure with 4 cards instead of the usual 5, making it immensely easier for you to cure all 4 diseases to win the game. The dispatcher can teleport players to one another across the board, super useful for sharing your cards. The medic can remove disease cubes really quickly, preventing outbreaks of disease that threaten to overwhelm you and the world. You win by finding the cures to all 4 diseases, but you can lose in a myriad of ways. If one disease spreads too far and you run out of cubes, if you let too many clusters of disease break out to their surrounding cities, which happens when there's more than 3 disease cubes on a city, or simply if you run out of time. This deck of cards here. And what can the CDC do against such overwhelming odds? Well, on your turn, you can do a combination of any of these few things. You can move, you can remove cubes, you can cure a disease if you have 5 of the same color card. You could perhaps build a research station, or you could use your special ability, like the quarantine specialist allows you to stop outbreaks. Literally everything you can do in your turn is written on this card here. It's like a little pocket Bible. It's beautiful. And that's because one of Pandemic's greatest strengths is that every single player gets to feel like their ability, their character gets to save the day at one point. At some point during a game of Pandemic, your special ability will come into use. And that's awesome. Everyone feels involved. Maybe the scientist manages to cure the last disease with only 4 cards because nobody else would have been able to get a 5th. Or maybe the dispatcher quickly gets the quarantine specialist to a hotbed of disease, preventing it from breaking out to unmanageable levels. No one character really stands out as the best, meaning it's this constant interplay of your strengths and your weaknesses, and every player gets to feel like they made a difference. And Pandemic is simple enough that you not only understand your strengths and weaknesses, but it's really easy to understand the strengths and weaknesses of your teammates as well. Because that is a flaw with some cooperative games. They rely heavily on you understanding intimately the capabilities of everyone else. In games like Spirit Island, it's almost impossible to truly gauge what every single person in your team can do, because every single character in Spirit has different innate powers, different cards, different resources and priorities in the game, making it really hard to truly figure out what the best direction forward is. Pandemic simply doesn't have that problem. You can look at basically everything your teammates can do in a single glance. Unlike a, law degree that you spent 5 years of your life on and aren't even using. Understanding strategy in Pandemic doesn't require years of study. But Pandemic is really made special in how these ominously coloured green cards work. Epidemic cards. See, at the end of every player's turn, you'll flip over a number of these city cards that tell you where the viruses are popping up, maybe New York, Mexico City, and Milan. And you'll also draw more city cards for your hand, which are great because you need those to cure the diseases. But when you draw an epidemic card from this same deck, like a country that refuses to quarantine its citizens after a virus reaches roughly 70,000 cases and 1,000 deaths, things get a lot worse. This is the true genius of Pandemic. See, when you draw an epidemic card, you'll be taking all of these cards here, and you'll be shuffling them, and you'll be placing them back on the top of this deck. Which means that whenever you draw these cards at the end of your turn, you'll be drawing the exact same cities which already probably have cubes on them. And if you ever have more than 3 cubes on a city, it instead outbreaks to every surrounding city, moving you closer to failure and making it immensely more difficult to contain. Not only are these epidemic cards a wonderfully simple mechanic, but they really capture the feel of managing these diseases. They intensify in cities that they started in, and then they spread from there. It's a wonderful part of Pandemic that it's so immersive. You really feel like you are the CDC having to manage these 4 diseases across multiple continents. It's great, and it's confusing and intense, and you end up in this horrible situation where you're like, okay, you go manage Hong Kong, and I'll manage London, and you manage Istanbul, but that means we're gonna have to let all of South America go up in flames, and even though we cure this one, it's gonna make it worse in the long run if we let that there, and that's why Pandemic is so wonderful. This is the puzzle of Pandemic. As a game, I would recommend it almost as broadly as I would a game like Settlers of Catan. It's simple and accessible, meaning that you can play with anyone, and the difficulty level can be whatever you want by simply adding more of these epidemic cards. And because it's a cooperative game, nobody feels like they've been screwed over by luck or other people, meaning everyone has a great time, which is a problem that some family games might have sometimes. You're no longer consumed by that innate desire to destroy your sisters at every turn, make them beg for mercy as you wipe them... Sorry, nothing. Moving on. Now, the hidden truth of Pandemic is that it's really just a more polished rule set of Matt Leacock's earlier game, Forbidden Island. So, if you either liked this game or were considering buying it, instead, get Pandemic. It's a better version of those same rules and concept on basically every level. But maybe you're done with Pandemic. You've mastered it. You need something more. You want the Black Death, or maybe the Purple Death. Well, in that case, you need On the Brink. It's the best expansion in the Pandemic franchise, and there are a lot of expansions. It's about being on the brink of disaster, of societal collapse, of outbreak, of absolute mayhem, and you are the only one who can stop it. Now, a lot of board game expansions don't really add that much. They might just add a 5th player, or they might just add more to the game without really changing how the game is played, which is one of the problems I have with some of these Settlers expansions. No, Pandemic on the Brink just doesn't have that problem. It instead introduces 3 new modes of playing the game, 2 of which are fantastic, and 1 of which is kind of lackluster. The first one, and my favourite, does away with these boring, green, pathetic epidemic cards and introduces the bold, the beautiful, the threatening red epidemic cards. And these do everything that the green epidemic cards did, but they also introduce virus mutations. One of these viruses will become immensely more dangerous than the rest. For example, they'll make it far more infectious, making that so that you place 2 cubes down instead of just 1. Or the dreaded card where even if you've cured it, a new strain mutates and it reappears on the board. This is exactly the sort of thing that a board game expansion should offer. More difficulty for experienced players and fundamentally changing the way that you have to strategize and play the game, not just adding more. Now, this mode does have an unfortunate side effect of sometimes being radically harder or radically easier than you originally intended. In the original game, you just kept on adding these epidemic cards until you got to the difficulty you wanted, and they're all the same. So, the more, the harder. But these cards here are sometimes a lot more devastating if drawn at the right or wrong time. For example, what if you draw that epidemic card that uncures the disease when you haven't cured it yet? Just, oh. Or you draw the one that puts 2 cubes down the board for everyone really early in the game or when it's already really bad. That makes it very, very hard. It's so much harder to predict, which some players will love, but it does mean you can't control the difficulty as much, which can lead to underwhelming or incredibly overwhelming games. The second mode introduces a bioterrorist, which is just so cool. This turns it into something of a competitive game, with one player secretly travelling about the world, putting out these especially deadly purple cubes, and the other players have to stop them. If the bioterrorist manages to get all these disease cubes out, then the bioterrorist wins. It's a nice mechanic, but it was never really the way that I felt Pandemic was meant to be played. There are other games which have a similar mechanic, and it's more built into the foundation of the game. It tends to work better, but it's still really interesting and still really fun, and it gives a more experienced player a more interesting lens to look at the game through, a fresh way of playing. Also, just points for coolness. The final variant of On the Brink uses these purple cards to create a strange disease that seemingly randomly pops up across the board with these purple cubes. Unfortunately, this variant doesn't really up the difficulty level like these threatening red cards do, and it doesn't really change the way that you have to strategize and play like the Bioterrorist variant does. And that's because it's also largely random. It's hard to strategize around and predict, and it just kind of introduces this mechanic that you can't control and isn't that interesting when it's being random, making it feel kind of unfair when you lose to it. It ultimately doesn't really play to the strengths of the original game, which the other variants do. Ultimately, I think when it comes to On the Brink, the game is really at those first 2 variants. The bottom line is this: Pandemic is an incredibly accessible and fun cooperative game that you should own. And On the Brink is the exact expansion you need when you want to add a new spark to it, when you've gotten used to the base game. Now, if you'll excuse me, my nation's in lockdown, in quarantine, and we have a virus to defeat. And not one that's just made of plastic little cubes. And on a more serious note, I was already planning on doing this review, so It's by pure chance that this happened. If you are watching this during the 2020 COVID-19 outbreak, otherwise known as the coronavirus, then it's possible you're in quarantine or self-isolating too. And if you are, that's great. Here's a graph as to why it matters that we socially isolate ourselves. It will save lives. Do your part. Be an introvert. Stay home. And in the meantime, stay nerdy. And I'll see you in the future. Approximately 3 months in the future if you're in New Zealand, because I'm not allowed to see anyone else. Except my girlfriend. She's waving at me. She does exist. I promise.